Jason's affair had been a reckless gamble, but he never expected it to end quite like this. Racing down the narrow, dimly lit street, he glanced back to see his lover's husband, a mountain of a man, hot on his heels with a look that could set fire to stone. Panic clouded Jason's judgment as he turned a corner, his heart pounding like a war drum. In his frantic bid for escape, he failed to notice the construction sign, his eyes fixed instead on the distant haven of his car. Fate, however, had other plans. His foot caught the edge of a half-covered trench, sending him sprawling into the depths of a sewer repair site. The chase ended abruptly, not with the dramatic confrontation he'd feared, but with the tragic, ignoble fall that left him trapped and alone. The irony was bitter and undeniable. He had been running from a broken promise, only to find himself ensnared by his own careless oversight, a victim of his own